You're standing in the shadow of a towering cathedral in Vienna, 1785 AD. The morning bells echo through cobblestone streets as carriages clatter past, their wheels grinding against ancient stone. But high above in the Habsburg Palace, behind walls thick enough to muffle screams, something else is happening. Something that will never appear in any official court record, never grace any royal portrait, never be whispered about in the gilded salons where Europe's elite gather to discuss politics and power. A child has been born to Empress Maria Theresa's bloodline. A child whose first breath brings not celebration, but horror. Not the kind of horror you'd expect from war or plague, but something far more insidious. The horror of imperfection in a world that demands divine perfection from its rulers. You see, this infant bears features that mark them as fundamentally different. The slightly upturned eyes, the flattened bridge of the nose, the single crease across their palm that medieval physicians would later describe in hushed Latin whispers as the mark of the cursed. What happens next will be repeated in royal courts across Europe for centuries. A pattern so consistent, so methodical, so absolutely chilling, that it reveals something profound about power itself. How it corrupts not through cruelty alone, but through shame. How it destroys not through violence, but through erasure. How it turns parents into executioners and love into abandonment, with nothing more than a whispered conversation behind closed doors. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Today, we know what this condition is. We have a name for it. Down syndrome, caused by an extra copy of chromosome 21, occurs in roughly 1 in every 700 births across all populations, all social classes, all bloodlines. We understand that children born with this condition can live full, meaningful lives, that they experience joy, love, friendship, and achievement just like anyone else, that their intellectual differences don't diminish their humanity or their capacity for happiness. But for centuries, royal families who built their entire legitimacy on the notion of superior breeding and divine appointment faced an impossible dilemma when such children entered their midst. These weren't just babies, they were living contradictions to everything monarchy claimed to represent. Proof that blue blood could produce the same variations as any peasant's lineage. Evidence that God's supposed favour didn't extend to genetic perfection. And so began one of history's most systematic cover-ups, a conspiracy of silence that spans centuries, crossed national boundaries, and consumed thousands of lives. Not through massacre or execution, though those happened too, but through something far more insidious, through the simple act of pretending these children never existed at all. What I'm about to reveal isn't just a collection of tragic stories. It's a window into how power operates when confronted with uncomfortable truths. How entire civilizations can collaborate in erasing inconvenient realities. How the most powerful families in history dealt with difference not through acceptance or accommodation, but through systematic denial that would make totalitarian regimes proud. Picture this. You're a royal physician in 16th century Spain, summoned to examine a newborn princess. The moment you see her face, your blood runs cold. Not because she's dying, not because she's deformed in the traditional sense, but because she's perfect in all the wrong ways. Perfect in her difference. Perfect in her inability to ever fulfill the political destiny mapped out for her before birth. You know what comes next because you've seen it before. The whispered conferences, the hastily rewritten birth records, the carefully orchestrated tragedy. Within hours, this child who drew breath and cried and reached for her mother's touch will officially cease to exist. The announcement will go out that the infant princess died of fever. Court mourning, will be observed for exactly the appropriate duration. Prayers will be said, masses commissioned, and the grieving royal parents will receive condolences from across Europe. But upstairs, in a wing of the palace that doesn't appear on any architectural plans, a very much alive child will begin a life sentence of invisibility, fed by servants sworn to secrecy, cared for by nurses who sign their names to death warrants disguised as employment contracts, loved perhaps, but only in the shadows, only in whispers, only in the spaces between official reality and human truth. This wasn't aberration. This was system. This was policy. This was how the divine right of kings dealt with divine inconvenience. From the frozen palaces of Russia to the sun-baked courtyards of Spain, from the fog-shrouded castles of England to the marble halls of Austria, the same scenario played out with mechanical precision. A different child is born. Features are noted, decisions are made, records are altered, lives are erased. But here's what makes this story particularly haunting. These weren't monsters making these decisions. These were parents. Mothers who had carried these children for 9 months felt them kick and turn and hiccup in the womb. Fathers who had planned their futures, imagined their weddings, dreamed of dynasties extending through their bloodlines. These were human beings capable of love, capable of tenderness, capable of the fierce protectiveness that defines parenthood across every culture and era. Yet when faced with children who couldn't fulfill the narrow definitions of royal acceptability, they chose erasure over embarrassment. They chose institutional cruelty over personal shame. They chose the survival of their dynasties over the lives of their own offspring. What we're about to explore together isn't just medieval barbarism or ancient ignorance. The last confirmed case of a European royal child with Down syndrome being completely hidden from public knowledge occurred in the 1960s. This isn't distant history. This is living memory. This is a pattern of systematic dehumanization that continued well into the modern era, protected by privacy laws and medical discretion, and the same institutional machinery that once served absolute monarchs. The children we're about to meet existed in the gaps between official history and human reality. They lived in the shadows cast by crown jewels and inherited titles. They breathed and laughed and cried in rooms that don't appear on palace tours, in wings that were sealed off and forgotten, in institutions that specialized in making inconvenient royalty disappear without technically committing murder. Their stories force us to confront a truth more disturbing than any medieval torture chamber. That sometimes the cruelest punishment isn't death, but the denial of life itself. Not execution, but erasure. Not murder, but the systematic theft of identity, recognition, and the fundamental right to exist in the world that birthed you. Let me take you to Sandringham Estate in 1909, where 4-year-old Prince John of the United Kingdom began experiencing seizures that would change everything. At first, his parents King George V and Queen Mary tried to maintain normalcy. John appeared in family photographs, played with his siblings, lived the life of any royal child. But as his condition worsened and signs of developmental delays became impossible to ignore, a familiar pattern emerged. By age 5, John had vanished from public life entirely. Not dead, as palace rumours suggested, but relocated to Wood Farm, a remote farmhouse on the estate. His devoted nurse, Charlotte Bill, became his sole companion in a world that had decided he no longer existed. Queen Alexandra, his grandmother, wrote in her private diary about visiting poor little Johnny, describing a child who collected acorns, watched gardeners work, and laughed at games only he understood. His own siblings were discouraged from visiting. His parents maintained careful distance, viewing him through the lens of duty rather than affection. When John finally died in 1919 following a severe seizure, Queen Mary wrote to a friend that his death was a release for the child, and perhaps the greatest mercy. Those words, release and mercy, echo through centuries of royal correspondence about such children, revealing a worldview where difference equaled suffering, where inability to fulfill dynastic duty meant life wasn't worth living. But John was fortunate compared to others. At least he had a name. At least someone remembered him fondly. At least his nurse kept his drawings, his photographs, the small treasures he collected. Travel deeper into Europe's royal crypts, and you'll find graves marked only as God's child or beloved infant, with no names, no dates, no connection to the thrones their occupants could never inherit. These anonymous burials represent children whose very existence was considered too dangerous to acknowledge, even in death. In Spain, court physicians wrote in coded Latin about infants born with what they termed Mongol features, using terminology that wouldn't become formal medical language for another 2 centuries. One physician, Diego Zapata, documented examining a princess whose name was literally scratched from official records. He noted her profound developmental delays, but also something else entirely: her extraordinary capacity for affection, her desire to embrace everyone she met, her pure joy at music and dancing even though she couldn't keep rhythm. Zapata ultimately burned at the stake during the Inquisition for suggesting these children might not be cursed, but simply examples of God's mysterious variety. His hidden notes, discovered in 1954, describe traits we now recognize as classic characteristics of Down syndrome. The same unconditional love, the same innocent joy, the same gentle nature that makes these individuals such gifts to families wise enough to embrace them. But royal families built on hierarchy, competition, and carefully controlled bloodlines couldn't afford such wisdom. These children's most beautiful qualities, their freedom from pretension, their inability to engage in political manipulation, their pure emotional honesty, made them fundamentally incompatible with royal life. The Ottoman Empire dealt with potential heirs through the cafes, luxurious prison where princes awaited their fate. Sultan Mehmed III reportedly had a son born with distinctive features who officially died in infancy, but actually lived 23 years in isolation. Guards reported strange sounds from his chambers, not the usual protests of imprisoned princes, but singing. The same songs repeated endlessly, and laughter at odd hours. When succession chaos erupted, and every room was opened to account for potential heirs, they found an adult man, with a child's mind, surrounded by thousands of pieces of colored glass, arranged in intricate patterns. He had spent 2 decades creating art no one would ever see, humming songs no one would ever hear, living a life no one would ever acknowledge. What happened to him in that moment of discovery? Records cease. Silence falls. Another ghost in palace walls. Even in the 20th century, as medical understanding advanced, royal families continued these patterns. Greece's exiled royals during the 1920s had a physician examine a teenage princess whose existence was completely unofficial. Born with Down syndrome and hidden from birth, she had been raised in secret by a loyal servant. When the girl developed pneumonia and needed medical care, her family's response wasn't joy at discovering their daughter lived, but an offer to pay the physician a fortune to solve the problem permanently. He refused, fled the country, and spent decades wondering what became of that girl who had clutched his hand and called him nice man repeatedly, the only words she knew. These weren't isolated incidents or products of medieval ignorance. This was systematic institutional dehumanization that continued well into living memory. The same psychological mechanisms that allowed parents to hide their different children, that enabled servants to maintain deadly secrets, that convinced entire courts to participate in elaborate fictions. These mechanisms persist today in subtler, but no less damaging forms. When we examine these forgotten royals, we're not just uncovering historical curiosities. We're exposing how societies create their disappeared, their unmentionables, they're systematically erased. The measure of any civilization isn't found in its palaces or achievements, but in how it treats those who don't fit predetermined molds, who can't play expected games, who exist outside boundaries of acceptable difference. These children remind us that every society constructs its own shadows, its own categories of people who somehow don't count as fully human. Royal families didn't create prejudices against disability, but their positions of power meant they bore special responsibility for perpetuating them. Their choices to hide, deny, and erase these children sent messages that echoed through every level of society about whose lives mattered and whose could be safely forgotten. Somewhere in Europe, in unmarked graves and forgotten corners of royal crypts, lie the bones of princes and princesses whose only crime was being born different, their names erased, their faces destroyed, their existence denied. Yet they lived. They breathed and laughed and cried and died, fully human despite every effort to pretend otherwise. In their silence, they speak volumes about what happens when bloodline matters more than blood, when appearance trumps reality, when fear of imperfection becomes more monstrous than any imagined defect. You are still standing in that Vienna cathedral shadow, centuries collapsed into a single moment of recognition. But now you understand, you're not witnessing isolated tragedy. You're seeing the intersection of power and shame, the collision between human variation and institutional denial, the terrible arithmetic that calculates some lives as worth less than the reputations built on their erasure. These forgotten children existed, they mattered, and in remembering them, we honor not just their stolen lives, but our shared humanity that transcends any crown, any title, any narrow definition of perfection that power demands but love knows better than to accept.